so nothing can prepare you for the feeling that you get when you're exploring a creepy and dark building when all of a sudden you hear the sound of a chainsaw revving somewhere in the background. And then when you least expect it, some maniac comes chasing after you with his or her shiny and terrifying toy. While there are plenty of iconic weapons wielded by enemies in our favorite horror games, something about chainsaws just reaches a whole new level of fear. Rather, it's the way that the sound of it makes your stomach drop, or the fact that most encounters with a chainsaw in horror games is an instant death situation. Chainsaws are just on a whole other level when it comes to terrifying weapons wielded by psychotic maniacs. So in this episode of Nerds Games, I'll be taking a look at all of my favorite horror games as I give you guys 10 chainsaw enemies that will forever haunt us in our nightmares. To keep things interesting, I'm only going to be including one entry per franchise. Also, as the title suggests, I'm focusing on enemies wielding chainsaws in horror games only. Finally, keep in mind that I'm only looking at chainsaw enemies, not any other type of saw-like weapons such as a buzzsaw or circular saw. But before we get started with today's video, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic and that bell icon to stay notified when I post a new video on the channel. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerds Games, and this is 10 terrifying chainsaw enemies in horror games. Let's get it. Number 10, Assault Tekken, Alan Wake. In the town of Bright Falls, a darkness has started to sweep the town and possess the residents. The people that have become possessed by the darkness are referred to as the Tekken. While most of the Tekken come in the form of traditional people, but protected by a dark force, there are a few that are a little more powerful and terrifying to deal with. These enemies are known as the Assault Tekken. More specifically, the Assault Tekken wielding chainsaws. This variation of Tekken are some of the most deadly and dangerous enemies that Alan Wake will come across. They can deal out massive damage to the point where they can normally take out the player in about 2 hits. On top of that, Assault Tekken are protected by the darkness, which makes them immune to gunshots until Alan uses his light to dispel that dark protection, shielding them from damage. Most enemies in Alan Wake will give you a hard time, but something about the sound of a chainsaw revving as a giant Tekken makes his way after you just adds the cherry on top. Number 9, Biggy Man, Splatterhouse. Despite being a retro arcade style video game, the original Splatterhouse surprisingly has some dark and scary themes. The enemies that you encounter throughout this cult classic will leave you scarred, especially the boss fights of the game. One such boss is Biggy Man. As the name suggests, Biggy Man is a massive dude who is just much taller and bigger than the player's character. In a game where up until now you have dominated every single monster that comes your way, Biggy Man immediately makes you feel small and helpless. For one, the guy is ripped as hell even in this retro game. 2, he's extremely difficult to beat as well, which I guess would make sense considering his size. 3, the dude adds more to his creepy scale by wearing a brown bag over his head. Yeah, something about a brown sack over a psychopath just makes sense, you know? And finally, and probably the most important, the guy has not 1 but 2 chainsaws in place of where his hands were. So yeah, twice the fun. Number 8, Sawyer Zombie, Doom 3. The Doom franchise has always been known as one of the most iconic and intense action first-person shooters since the 90s, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its fair share of horror elements. In fact, one entry of the franchise, Doom 3, dives into a completely different direction as it leans heavily towards the horror side of the Doom universe. Without a doubt, Doom 3 is the scariest game of the franchise by a long shot, and one of the things that contributes to that is the fact that there are chainsaw zombies. Yeah, you heard me right, chainsaw zombies. Also known as Sawyer Zombies, these guys create some of the more intense moments in the game as they are stronger than most regular enemies you encounter in the game. And sure, they may not appear much, with them appearing in 2 specific sections of Doom 3 if memory serves right, but they do make the most of their time on screen by giving nightmares to the players who came into the game expecting a fast-paced shooter only to be greeted by these massive, faster than normal zombies with chainsaws. Again, I'll repeat it one more time, zombies with chainsaws, enough said. Number 7, Hillbilly, Dead by Daylight. As one of the best asymmetrical horror games ever created, Dead by Daylight has a ton of unique killers to choose from, both licensed characters and original characters. And considering that chainsaws are one of the most terrifying weapons wielded by killers in horror movies and games, it's only natural that Dead by Daylight would feature at least one killer wielding a chainsaw. Well, technically there's 2, but we'll get to the other one in just a moment. For now, let's focus on the deformed redneck himself, the Hillbilly. As with other chainsaw enemies in other horror games, the Hillbilly has the ability to instantly down a survivor in a single shot if he hits them with the chainsaw. What makes him a little more terrifying than some chainsaw enemies out there, though, is the fact that 1, Dead by Daylight is a tense experience on its own, and 2, this guy literally charges across the map with his deadly chainsaw. Yeah, he has an ability that he can use that'll send him flying towards his target, and if he lands that attack, down goes the survivor. Survivors know that if they hear the sound of a chainsaw, they better get their dodging skills ready because one mistake can be disastrous. Number 6, Adam the Clown, Dead Rising. Despite Dead Rising being a zombie game created by the kings of survival horror themselves, Capcom, this is a franchise that's not actually really known for its scare factor. In fact, the Dead Rising games are more of a parody of the zombie genre as a whole. Still, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its fair share of psychotic characters that make your skin crawl. Take the infamous chainsaw-wielding clown of the first game, Adam. Not only does this dude take his job way too seriously, but he also comes after the player with not one, but 2 fucking chainsaws. Yeah, twice the fun again, Piggsy. To make matters worse, he has one of the creepiest clown voices that literally sounds like Mickey Mouse after he caught Minnie Mouse in bed with Goofy. Okay, yeah, that's kind of a disturbing picture. Either way, if you're like me and clowns creep you out, then I would definitely consider avoiding this boss at all costs because this guy is beyond creepy and disturbing. I mean, he even laughs at you as he's getting ripped apart by a chainsaw. Jesus, dude, what is wrong with you? Number 5, The Sadist, The Evil Within. As one of the best survival horror games I've ever played, The Evil Within is full of terrifying and dangerous enemies. From Lore Reborn to the Keeper, each of these creatures will continue to scare the living hell out of you from start to finish. And speaking of the start of the game, the first main enemy that Sebastian comes across in the game is a chainsaw-wielding maniac known as the Sadist. He may not be the most difficult boss in the game, but he's definitely one of the more terrifying introductions to a horror game courtesy of the intense chase sequences Sebastian finds himself in with the Sadist. The first section revolves around the player sneaking past the Sadist without getting caught, in which doing so could result in a game over. Then, after making it to a certain point, Sebastian has to run for his life while this chainsaw maniac chases him through the halls of Beacon Mental Hospital. Again, he's not the most dangerous or most difficult boss in the game, but considering how tense this chase sequence is and how impactful his presence is during the first section of the game, yeah, the Sadist is easily one of the more terrifying chainsaw-wielding enemies in a horror game. In fact, he was so terrifying that he was one of the 3 iconic bosses that made their return in Evil Within 2. Number 4, Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. While Dead by Daylight may be the best asymmetrical horror game out there, it's not the only one. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a game inspired by the movie of the same name, is another terrifying asymmetrical horror game that perfectly captures the horror elements of Leatherface and his family of cannibals. While Leatherface is also in Dead by Daylight, there's not that much more that can be said differently about him when comparing him to the other chainsaw-wielding Dead by Daylight slasher, the Hillbilly. Plus, in my personal opinion, Leatherface and the way that he's depicted in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game is just more intense, more accurate to the movie it's based on, and much more terrifying from the victim's side of the game. I say that because in this game, the victims start out in the basement of a random map. During the opening sequence of the game, one of their friends is being brutally killed by Leatherface while they slowly escape the area they find themselves in. After the opening sequence, Leatherface can begin searching for the other victims, and man, this is easily the most tense moment of the game. Regardless of where you find yourself in the basement, you could hear the sound of Leatherface's chainsaw as he runs around the basement searching for you, and it's truly a terrifying experience. On top of that, Leatherface can brutally kill victims faster than most killers in the game, and if you go up against someone that knows how to use Leatherface well, then there's a solid chance that you'll never even leave the basement. Once you find your way out of the basement, Leatherface is admittingly less intimidating thanks to all of the obstacles you can find around the map and how easy it is to hide from him, but man, those first few moments of being stuck in the basement with Leatherface is both intense and terrifying, that's for sure. Number 3, Piggsy, Manhunt. To this day, Manhunt remains one of the scariest and most brutal games ever created. In fact, due to its graphic content, the game was banned in some countries around the world. The brutality of this game was truly next level, and it was also filled with terrifying and iconic moments in video games. One such moment came from the mentally disturbed actor dressed like a pig, Piggsy. This guy is easily one of the most disturbed individuals of Manhunt, and that's saying a lot considering the type of characters that we come across in the game. Anyway, Piggsy is essentially a serial killer that was once an actor who eventually lost it when he was made into a cannibalistic murderer courtesy of Starkweather. Eventually, the player comes across him when exploring Starkweather's mansion, and man, this is one of the most intense moments. Wielding his chainsaw to chop up any and all poor souls that come across him, Piggsy was a deadly individual that would not hesitate in the slightest to chop you into bits and make you his next meal. It also didn't help that Piggsy kept up the weird persona that he created for the movies that his character was based on when he was an actor. This leads to some really disturbing moments, terrifying chase sequences, and even one of the better jump scares seen in a horror game.
Pigsy's gonna
Number 2, Sawrunner, Cry of Fear. Despite being a free-to-play game, Cry of Fear might arguably be one of the scariest games I've ever played. Seriously, the amount of jump scares and chase sequences in this game constantly kept me on my toes and made me scream more times than I could count. Anyway, one of the more intense moments of the game is when the Sawrunner begins chasing Simon, the main character of Cry of Fear. No, I don't mean the weird chainsaw balls fight prior to this, but yeah, he's also kinda creepy. No, I mean the crazy dude that literally bolts after Simon when he shows up. And as you would expect from a chainsaw wielding enemy, the Sawrunner will instantly kill Simon if he manages to catch up to him. The only way that you can keep your distance from the Sawrunner is by running as fast as possible while making your way around corners to slow him down. Still, each time the Sawrunner appeared, my heart dropped as I knew that I was in for one hell of a chase sequence. It also doesn't help that the dude is constantly screaming and howling at me as I'm trying to run away from him, which ultimately makes this entire sequence more terrifying and intense. God, I hated every moment he showed up, not gonna lie. Number 1, Dr. Salvador, Resident Evil 4. Of course, the scariest chainsaw enemy in a horror game goes to the ultimate chainsaw wielding maniac, Dr. Salvador. This dude was everything you could possibly want from a chainsaw enemy that'll scare the living shit out of you. He's fast as hell, which allows him to close the distance between you and him. He has an iconic and terrifying design that reminds us of Jason Voorhees in the original Friday the 13th films, complete with the brown sack over his head. And he has an instant kill attack, complete with iconic chainsaw death animations. What more could you possibly ask for from this legendary chainsaw maniac from the Resident Evil universe? Sure, there have been others to follow him in his footsteps throughout this franchise. The Bella sisters, the Chainsaw Magini, and even Jack Baker used a chainsaw during the basement fight of Resident Evil 7. But none of these guys can match the intensity and the iconic design that we got with Dr. Salvador the first time we encountered him during the opening sequence of Resident Evil 4. But that does it for this episode of Nerdspace Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Dr. Salvador the most terrifying chainsaw enemy in a horror game, or is there someone else deserving of that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.